Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Memory and Authority, The Uses of History in Constitutional Interpretation, by Jack M. Balkin. Narrated by Jonathan Todd Ross. Part 1. Making Historical Arguments. Chapter 1. Arguing with History. This is a book about how people use history when they interpret the Constitution. History matters to constitutional interpretation because people believe that history bestows authority on their arguments, or conversely, that it undermines the authority of opposing arguments. History matters in constitutional interpretation because authority matters. People employ history and constitutional law to make arguments for or against particular interpretations. Therefore, to study the uses of history in constitutional interpretation is to study the forms of argument that use history in constitutional interpretation. These uses of history are plural, not singular. When people interpret the Constitution, they employ a collection of standard types of constitutional argument. So, the uses of history in constitutional interpretation are the ways that people channel history through these standard forms of legal argument. In 1982, Philip Bobbitt pointed out that constitutional arguments tend to fall into different rhetorical categories. There were arguments based on the constitutional text, arguments about purpose, arguments about features of constitutional structure, arguments from previous judicial precedents, and so on. A few years later, Richard Fallon offered a slightly different list. Bobbitt called these different forms of argument modalities, and ever since then, constitutional theorists have used this term to describe the different forms of constitutional argument. When it came to history, however, Bobbitt and Fallon were heavily influenced by the debates over originalism that were just getting started. So both of them called arguments about the intentions of the framers historical arguments. By speaking in this way, they encouraged people to think that there was only one kind of historical argument, originalist argument, and more specifically arguments about original intention. This fostered an unnecessary confusion. Most constitutional law arguments that use history are not about the intentions of the framers. They may not even be about the history of the adoption of the Constitution or its amendments. In this book, I revisit the study of constitutional arguments that Bobbitt began. I offer a more expansive list that is better designed to explain how people use history when they make constitutional arguments. It turns out that there is no single modality of historical argument. Rather, history is useful for making many different kinds of constitutional arguments, and the way that people use history is shaped by the kind of argument they are making. How people use history, what they look for in history, how they characterize history, and what they emphasize and de-emphasize in history depends on the modality of justification they are using. This is the interdependence of history and justification. Most discussions of the uses of history in constitutional argument employ a fairly simple model. 1a. People use history to support or authorize a proposed interpretation of the Constitution. Or 1b. People use history to undermine their opponent's proposed interpretation of the Constitution. According to this model, the central question about the uses of history in constitutional law is whether people have gotten their history right. People might not get the history right because they are reading the history out of context, because the historical record is more complicated than they let on, because they are engaged in an anachronism, or because, as Alfred Kelly once put it, they ask questions of the past that the past cannot answer. But this simple model does not describe what is actually going on when people use history to make constitutional arguments. Instead, the situation is something more like this. 2a. People use a standard form of legal argument, for example, arguments from purpose, structure, consequences, tradition, precedent, and so on, that rests on a background or unspoken theory of legal justification, and they use history to help them make that kind of argument. Or, 2b, people use history to show why their opponent's proposed interpretation is unjustified given a particular modality of argument. How people use or misuse history, what they look for in history and how they characterize history, depends on the underlying modality of legal justification, and this modality may not be explicitly stated. Often it must be inferred. Not only is there not a single kind of historical argument, but there is not even a single kind of originalist argument. There are different kinds that correspond to the different modalities. Whether people are arguing about adoption history or non-adoption history, they still channel their historical claims through the same modalities in the same way. Originalist argument is a special case of a more general phenomenon. Moreover, not all arguments about the founding of the United States or about the adoption of the U.S. Constitution or its amendments are originalist arguments. Originalist arguments are what I will call in this book obedient uses of history. They look to history to find positive examples or precedents that we should follow today. But not all uses of history are obedient uses. Some historical arguments are very critical of people who lived in the past, including the founders and adopters of the Constitution. They deny that we should follow their practices and views, and argue that we must redeem our system of government from previous injustices. These critical uses of history treat the past as a negative precedent that we must transcend, not as a positive example that we must follow. Both obedient and critical uses of history are authority-constructing or constructive uses of history. They purport to offer relatively clear lessons from history that we can and should follow today. But still other uses of history are not designed to construct either positive authority or negative precedent. They are deconstructive in the sense that they try to show that the lessons of history are ambiguous and not easily adapted to our present situation. A. Collective memory. Some of the most important arguments in constitutional interpretation invoke collective memory. Collective memory is what a group, for example, a religion, a profession, a people, or a nation, remembers and forgets about its past. This combination of remembering and forgetting helps constitute the group's identity and structures its values and its commitments. Precisely because memory is selective, it may or may not correspond to the best account of historical facts that we now have available. The literature on memory uses several different terms: collective memory, cultural memory, and social memory, more or less interchangeably, as I will in this book. However, some scholars treat cultural memory as a special case of collective memory. Cultural memory refers to the narrative memory of now distant events that help constitute a group's identity, but that most people in the group did not live through. People commemorate or refer to these events and the persons and stories connected to them in cultural artifacts, documents, monuments, and artistic representations. The collective memory of the founding and Reconstruction, for example, is cultural memory. People recall or invoke cultural memory in public rhetoric, art, and social rituals, and most importantly for our purposes, in law and politics. The use of memory in constitutional argument is constitutional memory, a term coined by Reva Siegel. Constitutional memory shapes people's views about what the law means and why people have authority. Because constitutional memory is employed to legitimate the exercise of authority, Siegel explains, constitutional memory has a politics, and it can help rationalize all manner of governmental and societal relationships. Lawyers and judges continually invoke and construct constitutional memory. Judicial decisions both rely on constitutional memory and produce constitutional memory. What is remembered and what is erased have powerful normative effects. They shape our understanding of who we are and how things came to be, what is traditional and what is an innovation, who has committed wrongs and who has been wronged, what we owe to others and what they owe to us. Memory provides resources for understanding the world around us and assigning praise and blame. What is erased from memory, by contrast, can make no claims on us. Collective memory and forgetting affect all types of constitutional interpretation. All of the standard forms of constitutional argument may make use of collective memory, and lawyers and judges often use history in stylized ways. Arguments from collective memory take sides in historical events and often identify heroes and villains, positive and negative examples. Originalist arguments in American constitutional culture are often hybrids that invoke collective memory. They combine appeals to national ethos, political tradition, and honored authority with other modalities of argument. Many of the most important forms of constitutional interpretation, arguments from precedent, arguments from tradition, and arguments from original meaning or understanding, involve a mixture of memory and erasure. They emphasize certain elements of the past while effacing others. Yet the selectivity and erasure of constitutional memory can have ideological effects, and can bestow on constitutional claims a legitimacy that they do not always deserve. The scope of constitutional memory matters to legitimacy, because many features of constitutional legitimacy depend, whether directly or indirectly, on implicit notions of societal consensus, majority opinion, and the consent of the governed. But if the consensus is not real, if the majority is artificially constructed, and if the consent of the governed is not genuine, this undermines assumptions about legitimacy. At stake in constitutional memory is which historical figures and movements will count as makers of constitutional meaning for the present. If constitutional memory features only a small group of white men as the central actors, the American constitutional tradition belongs to them, and it is their views that matter. Women and racial minorities have constitutional rights only because these white men have allowed them to have rights. This is a false portrait of the country's history. When we engage in constitutional construction, therefore, we should embrace an expansive conception of collective constitutional memory. The constitutional tradition in the United States is a dialectical tradition full of disagreements and multiple perspectives from many different people and groups, from every period in the nation's history and from every part of society. It constitutes a rich source of competing ideas that later participants can draw on. These include the views and experiences of people left out of formal constitution making, as well as the claims of social and political movements that have shaped our constitutional tradition. These groups can provide both positive and negative examples for the present. The makers of constitutional meaning in the American political tradition are much broader than the Constitution's framers and adopters, or even those who influenced the framers and adopters. In constitutional construction, we may look to the ideas of people whose views were unpopular or minority positions in their own time, but whose constructions of the Constitution turned out to be far wiser than the dominant opinions of their day. Not all of the lessons of constitutional memory are positive. Not everyone in the past was heroic, and even people and groups that we celebrate today had serious flaws and failings. Some of the lessons of constitutional memory are deeply ambivalent, but all can be grist for the mill of constitutional construction. When we implement and apply the Constitution in our own time, many different groups and many different people can be makers of constitutional meaning. What matters is what their ideas and experiences mean for the present and whether they can serve as positive or negative examples for us today. B. Originalism and living constitutionalism. Much of the debate over the uses of history in constitutional interpretation is a debate about the merits of originalism. Originalism is a family of theories that argue that we should interpret the Constitution and its subsequent amendments consistent with its original meaning, or in some versions consistent with the original understanding of the ratifiers or the original intentions of the framers. People usually oppose originalism to living constitutionalism, which argues that the practical meaning of the Constitution adapts, and should adapt, to changing social conditions. My own theory of constitutional interpretation, living originalism or framework originalism, does not view originalism and living constitutionalism as opposed. It synthesizes these two positions, seeing them as two sides of a single coin. Living originalism has many advantages over the versions of originalism developed by the conservative legal movement. First, it is superior from the standpoint of constitutional theory. It has a better account of what constitutions are and how they actually operate in practice. Second, living originalism recognizes that the Constitution's democratic legitimacy depends on more than the moment of adoption, and that the work of political and social movements is crucial to the Constitution's legitimacy over time, even if, as in the case of the civil rights movement and the women's movement, their efforts do not result in new constitutional amendments. Third, living originalism is superior in its use of history. It is more compatible with the work of professional historians. It can accommodate disagreements among the ratifying public and the views of those shut out of formal constitution-making. It is better at avoiding historical anachronism, and it makes use of the entire history of the country rather than focusing solely on the history of adoption. Some originalists claim that originalism is required by the philosophy of language or by the rule of law itself. But most countries outside the United States do not employ originalism as their standard method of interpretation, even if their judges occasionally make arguments that Americans would call originalist. Nor, for that matter, is originalism the dominant interpretive approach in the 50 state constitutions, although state judges, too, sometimes appeal to original purposes and meanings. As I will demonstrate in this book, the best explanation for why Americans are attracted to originalism lies elsewhere. Originalism is a feature of national political culture, which is why it appears less frequently in state constitutions and outside the United States. It arose in the United States because of American cultural memory and American national identity. You will find people making arguments about original purpose and meaning throughout American history. But the rise of originalism as a general or comprehensive theory of constitutional interpretation is the product of the 20th century. Originalism was first taken up by liberals in the middle of the century, and then by conservatives who were responding to what liberals had done. Both originalism and living constitutionalism arose in response to constitutional modernity, the felt sense that the world of the framers had long since passed away, and that the problem for the present was how to be faithful to an ancient constitution in very different circumstances. Living constitutionalism arrived a little earlier in the 20th century. Originalism came a little later. But they are really twins separated at birth. They are complementary ways of dealing with the problem of ceaseless change and increasing separation from the past. Originalism emphasizes that we must restore what was lost, return to ancient verities, and respect long-standing traditions. Living constitutionalism emphasizes that we must accept the reality of change, adapt successfully to new conditions, and work to improve and redeem our political project from generation to generation. When Americans argue about the Constitution, they employ both of these cultural narratives, although how and when they use these stories may vary from situation to situation and from person to person. Moreover, Americans use both of these narratives not only to forestall reform, but also to justify reform. In the United States, originalism often serves as a doctrine of revolution. Franklin Delano Roosevelt invoked the framers to justify the New Deal. The Warren Court used originalism to overturn old precedents, and the conservative legal movement, which adopted originalism as its common language, has been devoted to remaking American constitutional law for the past half-century. C. History is a resource, not a command. This cultural account helps explain a great deal about how Americans actually use originalism, and history more generally, in constitutional argument. A recurrent theme of this book is that in constitutional interpretation, history is a resource, not a command. It is a way that we reason with each other in the present rather than a collection of mandates from the past. When I say that history is a resource, I do not mean that it is merely a rhetorical resource for making arguments. History can also be a source of edification. But above all, it is a potent source of meaning. The past is constitutive of our world and what our world means to us. History can be a resource for argument because people's beliefs and worldviews are shaped by past causes of which they may be only dimly aware, and equally important, by their memory of the past. The rhetoric of history has power because memory has power. History is a resource for argument because we are made out of it. Lawyers sometimes talk about history as if it could generate legal commands in the present, but this is a mistake. It is true that where the text of the Constitution announces a clear, unambiguous rule, people treat the text as the source of a legal obligation. But that is not because history itself commands anything. It is because duly enacted law remains in force until it is lawfully changed. This feature of the rule of law is as true of new texts as of ancient ones. Most contested questions of constitutional interpretation, by contrast, arise when the text is not clear. This can happen, for example, when the text uses principles, standards, or other vague or abstract language, and we must apply it to new situations, or when the text points in contrary directions or is silent, and we must reason from principles of constitutional purpose and structure. When this happens, we engage in constitutional construction. We must decide the best way to implement the Constitution through doctrines, practices, and institutions. Older constructions, in turn, generate new interpretive problems as new situations arise. These problems often lead to new constructions or modifications of older ones. Constitutional law in the United States is a history of successive constitutional constructions, which build on and apply older constructions, or modify and displace them with newer ones. History matters to constitutional interpretation because history is a powerful resource for constitutional construction. People argue for and against proposed constructions by channeling history through the standard modalities of argument. Because most contested questions occur in the zone of constitutional construction, most arguments that use history occur there as well, including arguments from adoption history. Most originalist arguments are really arguments about how to construct the Constitution. They are a special case of how people use history generally. That is why judges sometimes pay careful attention to originalist arguments, and sometimes ignore them completely, and why sometimes they are quite persuasive and sometimes quite unpersuasive. Most of the originalist arguments that lawyers and judges make about the Constitution are hybrids. They combine appeals to national ethos, tradition, and honored authority with the other modalities. This hybrid nature gives originalist arguments their distinctive character. Because originalist arguments appeal to ethos, tradition, and honored authority, they trade on our identification with the past and our willingness to accept the values of the past as our values, and the decisions of the past as our decisions. This means that originalist arguments will normally not be persuasive unless we can plausibly accept the values of the framers and adopters as our own, or can somehow recharacterize these values, for example at a high level of generality, so that we can plausibly accept these values as our own. Conversely, when the values of the framers and adopters appear too alien or irrelevant, lawyers and judges generally avoid making originalist arguments. This is why the actual practices of American lawyers and judges do not correspond to academic theories of originalism, that argue that originalism is baked into the meaning of the Constitution and is always mandatory. Sometimes lawyers and judges pay no attention to originalist arguments and just argue about doctrines and precedents. Sometimes they are aware of originalist arguments, but reject them as irrelevant or unworkable. Because Americans have different values, they will also disagree about when we should identify with the values of the framers or adopters, and they will characterize the work of the framers or adopters in different ways. So, although originalism presents interpretation as a matter of renouncing our own normative choices and simply following the commands of the framers or adopters, it often reconstructs and remembers what the framers or adopters said to better suit the interpreter's values. That is to say, originalism is both an inquiry into the past and a form of historical ventriloquism. We make the past speak our normative values in the form of commands so that we can then obey them. Because originalist arguments are appeals to the nation's cultural memory, non-originalists should not avoid them. They can and should make originalist arguments too. In politics, cultural memory belongs to everyone, and everyone has a stake in the stories we tell about ourselves and about how things came to be. Everyone has a stake in what is remembered and what is forgotten, because memory is a source of political power. If people refuse to claim memory and tradition for themselves, they will be governed by other people's versions. The country's history is far broader than just the history of its framers and adopters. There is also the history of social and political movements that succeeded and failed, and the history of people from all walks of life who had views about the Constitution. They offer both positive precedents and negative examples that can instruct us in the present. Many people in the nation's history were excluded from political power and shut out of constitution-making, but still made claims on the Constitution. They may not be as celebrated as our famous framers, but if they have something to teach us, they can still be makers of constitutional meaning for us today. D. When lawyers and historians argue about the Constitution. One purpose of Bobbitt's original account of the modalities was to show how everyone, and not just lawyers, could make constitutional arguments. But of course, most of the people who use history and constitutional law are lawyers, judges, and legal academics. Lawyers and academic historians often quarrel about the right way to use history in constitutional interpretation. Some academic historians complain that lawyers misuse history, while the latter respond that historians do not understand legal argument. Although conservative originalists play a prominent role in these disputes today, the disagreements long predate the rise of originalism. Lawyers try to escape the criticism of historians through two standard stories that emphasize the differences between what lawyers and historians do. According to the first story, lawyers employ specialized skills of legal exegesis that historians do not understand. According to the second, lawyers require a usable past that historians will not provide. These two stories are familiar but a bit misleading. With respect to most of the modalities of constitutional argument, historians are as well equipped to make constitutional claims as lawyers are. In fact, plenty of disagreements between lawyers and academic historians do not concern the distinctive skills of lawyers at all. Rather, they arise from controversial theories of interpretation that many lawyers do not accept either. Emphasizing lawyers' professional differences from historians actually disguises disagreements among lawyers about how to use and how not to use history. So when lawyers try to stiff-arm academic historians, often they are actually engaged in long-running disputes with other lawyers who disagree with their interpretive theories, their methods, and their conclusions. Part of the reason why lawyers quarrel with historians is that they want to assert law's methodological autonomy. But the more that lawyers try to assert the methodological autonomy of law from history, the more they will fail. Ironically, because of law's distinctively adversarial professional culture. Lawyers want to persuade audiences and win arguments with their opponents. And in order to win those arguments, lawyers will search for ever-new historical sources and
Sample complete. Ready to continue?